Guys, we've got a very interesting piece of analysis coming up ahead. Now, we're going to talk about how budget surpluses can act to achieve the goal of external stability. Now, we know the goal of external stability, which I'm just going to highlight here, can be achieved by three factors. So we have one, a low current account deficit, perhaps around 3 to 4% of our GDP. A sustainable net foreign debt, and also a stable currency. So in this case, the Australian dollar. What we're going to focus on is how a budget surplus can intend to slow aggregate demand in order to achieve this low current account deficit of perhaps around 3 to 4% GDP. So we're not going to worry about sustainable net foreign debt because, as we know, net foreign debt is closely tied with this idea of a low current account deficit, and similarly, the stable dollar again is tied with this idea of achieving a low current account deficit. Okay, so what does high aggregate demand cause a high current account deficit, or a large current account deficit, I should say. I'm going to rewrite this. Large current account deficit. So there are two reasons of why high aggregate demand causes a large current account deficit. And the first reason is that there is spending on imports. So we associate usually a high aggregate demand with high levels of confidence, income, and therefore purchasing power. And this means that we have a greater marginal propensity to import if current domestic goods and services don't satisfy the needs and wants that we have. So again, when we have high aggregate demand, this means that we are spending on imports. And again, the second reason of why high aggregate demand causes large CAD is the reason of this reduction in exportable surplus. And what this means is that when people start to consume more, so we have aggregate demand equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. When people start to consume more here due to high confidence, greater incomes, and a greater purchasing power, this means that people will start to consume more, and this would take away from what we can export. So let's say an economy makes $100 million worth of goods and services. If initially we consumed 80 million and we exported 20 million in equilibrium, we will see that exports are valued at 20 million as such. However, if aggregate demand suddenly increases, and we're not only demanding $100 million worth of goods and services, we're demanding, say, 120 million. This means that we have a greater propensity to consume, and let's say this increases to 90 million now. And the rest of the goods being 10 million, we have left for export. So therefore, even though demand for exports are exogenously determined by overseas demand or external sector demand, because we have a limited amount of goods and services ready to export, this means that our exports would inherently decrease. We'll just put a downwards arrow there. Okay, so that's why high aggregate demand can cause a large CAD. So we know that the current account deficit is caused by two things. I'm just going to note up here. The current account deficit is caused by two things: a deficit in the balance on goods and services, as well as a deficit on the balance of primary incomes. So there are two reasons why we have a current account deficit, and we're just focusing on this one here, the deficit in the balance of goods and services due to this increased spending on imports and this reduction in exportable surplus. So fortunately we have budgetary policy to counteract this problem of a high current account deficit. And so if we remind ourselves, once we have a sustainable or low current account deficit of 3 to 4%, this is a movement towards achieving this goal of external stability. Okay, so we assume that during high levels of aggregate demand, this means there has been an economic upswing. So this means confidence is high or incomes are very high, and we're experiencing a boom. So looking at the business cycle, we are somewhere around here. So we are at a boom phase around here. So we're around boom, or at least approaching a boom. So what the budgetary policy can do is it can use one of two things. So solutions, it can use one of two things. Well, it can use both. One, automatic stabilizers, or if these don't work, they can add on to it by using discretionary stabilizers to slow down aggregate demand. So what they could do is, because of our incomes naturally increasing due to this high aggregate demand, it means we are being taxed more, and there will be less G spending. So since government spending is also a component of aggregate demand, we can see that aggregate demand would then decrease. And similarly, because we are experiencing high levels of income, this would mean a decrease again in transfer payments. And since transfer payments are again recorded in this consumption category, by decreasing transfer payments, it means that consumption again would decrease from the original position before this increase in economic activity. So if the automatic stabilizers here don't or are insufficient in slowing aggregate demand, what the government could do is it could use discretionary stabilizers to counteract this. So this means increase taxation again, and it of course could also mean decrease spending, and all these other natural features built into this budget that the government could use in order to slow down economic growth. And when economic growth or economic activity is slowed, then this periods of high aggregate demand will actually slow down, and we will return back to this trend line phase here. And again, because we see that characteristics of high aggregate demand mean that consumer confidence is high and that we're spending a lot on imports, as well as reducing the number of exportable surplus that we have, by reducing aggregate demand using contractionary budgetary policy, there we'll see that over time the economy will return back to this trend rate of growth there, and therefore increase or decrease spending on imports. So over time this will decrease, and then exportable surplus again will increase. And so that's how budgetary policy can use contractionary policy to increase budget surpluses, to slow down aggregate demand, and therefore lower our current account deficit, moving the economy towards this goal of external stability.